Good morning, y'all. It's good to be here this morning as we continue to walk through the book of Hebrews together. I hope you're enjoying our study so far and you're benefiting from it. Certainly, it's been a beneficial and challenging study for me so far. We are 10 weeks in today. I know that's kind of crazy to think about, but we are 10 weeks into our study so far, and I hope that it has been a beneficial one for you. Last week when we were together, we were in Hebrews, the 4th chapter, looking at the first 13 verses or so of that text. And as we did, we talked about this idea that there awaits for us the rest of God. And we talked about the importance of keeping our eyes fixed on Jesus, to go back to 2 weeks ago, and how we need to be careful to make every effort to enter that rest. Well, Hebrews 4:13 kind of wraps up the first section of the book. And in chapter 4 and verse 14, we move into the next section of the text. And so that's where we find ourselves today, in Hebrews 4:14 through chapter 5 and verse 10. Well, in this first section that we've just concluded, in Hebrews 1:1 through 4:13, we focus largely on the sonship of Jesus as our faithful champion who leads us through the wilderness by his own suffering. Hebrews 4:14, though, is going to start us into a new section that really takes us all the way through chapter 10 and verse 18. One that focuses on the high priesthood of the Son, who redeems us from our sins through suffering. In this regard, then, as we move into this next section, Hebrews 4:14 through 16 is a transitional text. It looks back to the themes that were already introduced: priesthood, sonship, suffering, temptation. But it also points us forward to the major themes that await us in this next section: that of an empathetic high priest who provides grace and mercy. In Hebrews 2:17 and 18, we saw Jesus heralded as a faithful and merciful high priest. In chapter 3, verse 1 through chapter 4, verse 13, we saw that the Son was indeed faithful. And so with these ideas in mind, our text today of Hebrews 4:14 through 5:10 emphasizes the compassionate and merciful character of the Son. Our high priest, as we will see him today, is both faithful and compassionate. He faithfully carried out his task as high priest as he suffered death for everyone. But he compassionately fulfilled his task as an empathetic high priest who shared the experience of our suffering in death. The theme that holds this text together today, then, of Hebrews 4:14 through chapter 5, verse 10, is the compassion of Jesus as our high priest. And that's what I want us to look at today. This compassion enables perseverance as we boldly go before the throne of grace and mercy to receive help in our times of need. Just as the original hearers of this sermon needed grace and mercy in their wilderness and compassion for their weaknesses, so we, as believers today, need that same grace and compassion from Jesus. By looking at and understanding Jesus as a gracious and compassionate high priest, it encourages us to hold firm to the faith that we profess, as we'll read in verse 16 of chapter 4, and to approach the throne of grace with confidence. Indeed, when we understand that Jesus is our compassionate high priest, it encourages us to persevere in our difficulties and to turn to him in prayer for our strength. It emboldens faith because we have the knowledge that Jesus both cares and is able to deal with our weaknesses because he himself has experienced those weaknesses. To quote an old hymn, this text reminds us that Jesus knows Jesus cares. I hope you have your Bibles with you this morning, and if so, go on and open them to Hebrews chapter 4. We'll begin there in verse 14. Starting in verse 14, we find these words. Since then, we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need. This is indeed one of the most powerful texts in Hebrews, and arguably one of the most well-known ones. Its striking character, I think, though, is often lost on us because of its familiarity. Sometimes things that we hear a lot and things that we are more familiar with don't seem as truly revolutionary or truly significant as they are. The shocking nature of the assertion of the Son's high priesthood is lost on us because it is so common for us to think in these terms. In particular, that the Son of God shares our weakness. But y'all, this is a shocking theological statement. This text is telling us that God incarnate, God Himself, God in the flesh, God, the almighty sovereign creator of heaven and earth, literally understands what we go through. If this text were not so familiar to us, it would knock us off our feet. It would just astound us that God in His infinite greatness could understand us. But despite its familiarity, it has not sunk deeply into our hearts. As I've been preparing for this course, I'm using a number of materials, one of which is a book written by Dr. John Mark Hicks, who's a professor of Bible at Lipscomb. But in his work, he talks about how we tend to think of Jesus as a Teflon human, one whom nothing sticks to. Like we read and we know, but because Jesus was sinless, it must mean that He really didn't hurt, or He wasn't really tempted, or He could not have sinned. We get, I think, so caught up in this idea that Jesus was perfect that we sometimes forget what it took to be perfect. We think it was just that, He must not have dealt with the same kinds of things. He was God. It must have been easier for Him than it was for us. As a result of this, Jesus still remains somewhat distant. And we turn to other sources for genuine empathy. Because despite the truth of this text here in Hebrews 4, I think it's easy for us to still not fully comprehend, to not have internalized what it means when it says that Jesus is not unable to sympathize with our weaknesses. This revolutionary truth here, though, is surrounded in this text at the end of Hebrews 4 with two major messages of encouragement. Verse 14 encourages its hearers to hold on to their confession of faith because we have a great, that is, exalted, ascended into the heavens, sitting at the right hand of God, great high priest. Verse 16 encourages hearers to pray for help in their times of need. So what we see is that the Hebrew writer here calls us to persevere, to hold fast to our confession, and to pray. Pray boldly. The idea here is of a frank conversation, to speak openly, to not hold back in our statements and our sentiments to God. Mike was talking about this recently in a sermon about how we need to be people who approach God and are not afraid to let our opinions and our feelings be exposed to God. God can handle them. And so, in this message, in the midst of this message of persevering and praying, connecting it all together is this news, is this truth that the Son of God has empathy for humanity as their high priest. Since we have a faithful and merciful high priest, a fellow human who was obedient through his suffering, and thus faithful, and who experienced our weaknesses and is thus merciful, since we have a faithful high priest who has been exalted to the right hand of God, the encouragement of this text is that we should persevere and we should pray and turn to Him for our strength. There's been a debate, however, around the Greek word translated sympathize here. The text we famously know says, "We do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with us." But it's probably more accurate to use the word empathize. Sympathy and empathy are two related concepts, but they are different. To sympathize is this idea of to share in the sorrow, to share in the hurt and the pain. Empathy is to be able to understand from where you have been. To have walked in those shoes. To have been there yourself. We've had several in our congregation this past week who've lost loved ones. And I can say, I'm so sorry about the loss of your dad. But fortunately, that's not something I have experienced. I can sympathize in that situation, but not empathize. However, when I say I'm sorry for the loss of your grandfather, now that is something I can empathize with. That's a pain I have experienced. That's a hurt I do know in a different way. And so really when we read the word here that Jesus sympathizes with us, it is not just sympathy, it is empathy. It is not simply that Jesus knows about our weaknesses, but that He has experienced our weaknesses. He is empathetic because He too has been tempted in every way just as we have. He has shared in the experience of temptation. Jesus has shared our weaknesses in that He has been tempted in every way like we have. He has shared the experience of temptation, but done so without sin. But do not let that truth deceive us. Just because Jesus experienced temptation and did not sin does not mean that He did not experience the full weight of temptation. It does not mean that it was easy for Him to say no. It does not mean that He got the light treatment. No, I believe it's likely that Jesus experienced temptation more deeply than we ever have. So often when we face temptation, we never feel its full power or pull because we give in too quickly. We say uncle and the temptation is over. We give in to it. We accept the sin and give in to the temptation rather than continuing to resist. But Jesus, who never tapped out, experienced the full force of temptation as Satan pulled out all the stops. I believe it is probably far more correct to say that Jesus experienced temptation more deeply and more acutely than we ever have, and yet without sin. Jesus understands. He knows temptation. He knows weakness. And he probably knows it far more than we give him credit for. Nevertheless, he was faithful. But with that experience, Jesus is more than just faithful. He is also compassionate. Our merciful high priest who dispenses mercy and grace to those who cry out for help in times of need. And so this text here at the end of Hebrews chapter 4 is a critical text for us understanding Jesus and why it is so significant that he is indeed our high priest. But as we move into chapter 5, we're going to see a couple of other things stand out about Jesus the high priest. Starting there in verse 1, it says, "For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weakness. Because of this, he's obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, 'You are my son, today I have begotten you.' As he says also in another place, 'You are a priest forever, after the order of Melchizedek.'" In order to appreciate this assertion that Jesus, the Son of God, is our faithful and merciful high priest, the Hebrew writer here reminds the audience about the Levitical high priesthood. He takes us back to what it meant to be a high priest. And these are things that are familiar to us. Remember, I know it's been a while now, but we spent some time at the beginning of our class talking about the priesthood because I knew this moment was coming where we were going to start to move into this section about Jesus as high priest, and we needed to understand some things. And so the Hebrew writer is going to do a similar thing here in bringing up a couple of core truths about the priesthood. First thing he says is that the high priests have to be human beings. High priests are humans. They share the human experience, including weaknesses. They are humans representing humans before God and to God. They represent humans authentically because they share the experience of humanity. And consequently, he says, they deal gently with sins of ignorance and weakness because they know the frailty of fallen humanity. He says a high priest has to understand the people. And because they themselves are human, they understand and deal gently with human weakness. Second, here, God calls high priests. The high priest is not self-appointed, but rather divinely appointed. We see that Aaron was called as the high priest. He began the Levitical order that we talked about, that we are so familiar with in the law of Moses. In the same way, the Son of God was also called to be a priest, just as Aaron had been called. But notice here in verse 5, that he says, "So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest." He does not use the term Jesus or Son. Those are the terms we've seen almost exclusively to this point. This is the first use of Christ, but it was not unintentional. No doubt the use of the word Christ is designed to emphasize the anointed status of the Son. as Jesus the Christ, which we talked about some in our Foundations of Faith class. By calling him Jesus the Christ, we are saying he is the anointed Messiah of God. In the same way that the high priest was anointed, Jesus is the anointed of God. Even anointed to be God, to be the priest as God's Messiah. It's also worth noting that the introduction of Aaron here at this point in the text. By introducing Aaron, it means that Hebrews has now reminded the audience that this letter, this sermon, has brought to the audience's attention every major leader and figure at the beginning of the Mosaic covenant. We've dealt with angels, we have dealt with Moses, we have dealt with Joshua, and now we have dealt with Aaron. And at every point, what we have seen is that the Son is superior. At every point, the Son has been superior. He was superior to the angels, he was superior to Moses, he was superior to Joshua, and even as priest, he is superior to Aaron. Moreover, this superiority as priest comes because he is not a Levitical priest. Verse 6, quoting from Psalm 110, tells us that he is a priest in the order of Melchizedek. And so, while the author, the Hebrew writer here, introduces Aaron, he quickly notes that Jesus' priesthood was greater than the priesthood of Aaron. The priesthood of Jesus is forever, and it is from a different order. And while we're going to deal with this idea a lot more, and in far greater detail when we spend a couple of weeks in Hebrews chapter 7, it is important here as well. Indeed, the author of Hebrews seems to be emphasizing the compassionate and merciful character of Jesus as high priest through the shared experience of obedient suffering, even though he was the Son. From there we come to verse 7. In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered. And being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him, being designated by God a high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Here we're introduced to the empathetic Jesus. Jesus, we see, offered prayers and petitions during his wilderness experience, during his period of suffering, during his sojourn on this earth. These prayers and petitions, verse 7 tells us, were accompanied with loud cries and tears. This is undoubtedly a description of Jesus in Gethsemane. A text we're all familiar with, an account we're all familiar with, where Jesus prayed fervently that God would save him from death, where his tears were great and his sweat became like drops of blood. The agony of Gethsemane was internal. Jesus knew that this was a moment of existential crisis and suffering. Jesus knew what lay ahead. And in that moment, the inner man of Jesus agonized over the decision to obey the will of God. He agonized over the cost of obedience and faithfulness. Yet though he was a son, though he could have chosen another path, he obeyed. The text says he learned obedience. He learned from what he suffered, and he learned through his suffering. Particularly for Jesus, the suffering under consideration here was death. Consequently, the main point appears to be that Jesus, who was strengthened in the midst of this struggle through prayer, decided to obey the Father's will through suffering death on the cross. He decided to obey and thus learned obedience. Obedience was not automatic here. Jesus didn't just automatically obey because he was the Son of God. No, he decided to obey. And in deciding, in choosing to obey, he learns obedience. But that decision perfected his obedience. His obedience went all the way. He completed his task, and as a result, he was exalted to the right hand of God as high priest. There he became our champion and the source of our salvation. He became our high priest who made atonement for sin and is now able to help those who are being tempted, to take us back to Hebrews 2:17 and 18. Jesus, our high priest, suffered. He faced weakness. He chose the greater path of obedience, and in doing so, he was perfected. His faith, his obedience was perfected. He completed his task, and indeed now sits at the right hand of the throne of God as our compassionate high priest. And so then, as we wrap up our time together this morning, once again, I hope the encouragement from this text is indeed clear for you. Because it most simply is that Jesus knows, Jesus cares. The incarnate Son of God is an empathetic priest. Certainly, he sympathizes with his people. He hurts when they hurt, just as we hurt when we see someone hurting. But more than that, he empathizes. Empathy is about shared experience. Empathy means you have walked in another's moccasins. You have been there, done that. And you share in an experience and a pain that can only be understood by someone who has been there before. God does not look upon our suffering at a distance. Rather, God came near in Jesus. The Son learned obedience through suffering, and through his humanity, he shared our experience in our suffering. God himself learned what it was like to hunger, thirst, be tempted, and die. Jesus is an insider when it comes to suffering. He was no mere sympathetic spectator. He suffered. He was tempted. He entered and shared the human experience with all of its weakness and frailty and pain. He knows the sting of death. He knows the pull of temptation. He knows the hurts and pains of life in a fallen and broken world. This reality means that Jesus is indeed able to help in our temptations and trials because he himself was tempted and tried. Our compassionate high priest understands us as an insider, not an outsider. He understands us as one who shared in our weaknesses. He understands us as one who has walked in our shoes. And thus we can approach him with boldness because we know he is compassionate. We approach him with the assurance of grace and mercy because we know He understands us. I know right now that there are a lot of people watching this morning who are hurting, who are dealing with pain and loss and grief, sickness, uncertainty, and all kinds of struggles. But if I know that, how much more does Jesus know that? How much more does Jesus understand that? In the midst of this difficult time, in the midst of your pain and your hurt and your trials and your temptations, may we all find comfort in the words of the Hebrew writer, that we have a high priest who understands. And because He understands, let us persevere and let us pray, knowing that He will meet us with grace and mercy and give us the strength we need for our journey.